I've had this idea for a while about building the world's most over-engineered website. This is a space for me to learn and explore in public on the topic of web dev infrastructure and our popular cloud providers. I'm not sure exactly where we're going with all of this, but in this first episode, we're going to look at getting started with Azure and Terraform. So let's dive right in. The website that we're going to be using is this very simple and plain HTML file. Nothing fancy going on here so far. We can serve it locally by running npx serve and have it available to us on localhost here in the browser. And that's it when it comes to the application itself. Now, in our repository, the simple website itself is in the app folder, but most of the magic for this first episode is happening in the infra folder. But before we deep dive into that one, let's look at some prerequisites that we need to get started here. So the first thing I needed was an account on Azure. So I signed up using GitHub and got myself a Azure account. And I actually got credited with $200 that we can get started with, which is great. Besides an account on Azure, we also want to install the Azure CLI. And if you're on a MacBook like I am, we can do this through Homebrew. Once installed, we have AC, so the Azure CLI, available to us in our terminal. We also want to go ahead and install Terraform on our computer. We can do this through Homebrew as well. And once installed, Terraform should also be available to us on our system. Now, the neat thing with Azure and the CLI is that you can actually log in and authenticate yourself in the CLI, which will be very helpful so that Terraform later can use our credentials when we work with Terraform. And we can authenticate ourselves using AC login. This will open up your browser where you authenticate against Azure, and then you'll be redirected back to your terminal, and you can see the different subscriptions that you have available. Now, I only have one. I'm going to press enter to authenticate myself with that default one. So now that we have an Azure account, we have the Azure CLI installed, we've authenticated in the Azure CLI, and we have the Terraform CLI installed. Let's look briefly at what Terraform actually is. So my understanding is that Terraform is the industry standard today to manage infrastructure as code. And the idea here is that rather than configuring and setting up your infrastructure, you're managing it, you're describing the state of the infrastructure in code so that you can tear it down and then redeploy, kind of reset up your whole infrastructure all at once. And this is at the core of good practice when it comes to DevOps these days, managing your infrastructure as code. And Terraform is the tool that we're going to do that with. So diving into our infra folder here in our project, we have this main.tf file. So this is the Terraform file that is describing our whole infrastructure. And getting started here, the first things that we see on the screen here is just some basic setup for terraforming. We're saying that we're going to use the Azure Resource Manager as a provider, as a Terraform provider. And then we are including our subscription ID to that provider. The last thing we do at the bottom here is that we're creating an Azure resource group and naming it and giving it a location, a region in Azure. And these resource groups, I'm thinking of as like a folder or like a project within Azure. All the other resources that we create, we will attach to this resource group. So in order to move towards a state where we can actually deploy our very simple web application on Azure, the next thing we need is to set up some networking in Azure. And the different resources that we'll use here is a virtual network given an IP range, and then a subnet, which will be a subset of that network with a smaller IP range. And then we have something here called a network security group. So once we have a network within Azure, we're using the network security group here to tell what communication is allowed to this network. And the rules that we've been able to add here at the beginning is to allow SSH, HTTP, and HTTPS. So whenever we later deploy a virtual machine on this network, we want to be able to SSH into it. And we also want to be able to serve HTTP traffic to and from it. The next network-related resource that we need is a public IP address. So the goal here eventually is to deploy our application in a virtual machine. And in order for that machine to be accessible and available on the internet, we need a static IP address that is always pointing to our virtual machine. So we do this with the public IP Azure resource and setting the allocation method here to static. Now, the next one here, the network interface that Claude earlier suggested that I set up, I'm not entirely sure about the details here, but from my understanding, this is used with the IP configuration here to map this public IP address that we have facing outwards towards the internet and be able to map that to our subnet so that we're feeding whatever comes in through the public IP, we're going to feed that into the subnet that we defined earlier. The last resource that we have here related to the network is an interface security group association. Honestly, I'm not sure what this is, but with the help of Claude, we're going to add it. So now that we have our network configured, the next part is about our virtual machine. So this is a machine that is going to run Ubuntu that we want to spin up and attach to this subnet, this network that we created inside Azure. And there are a few things that I want to try and point out in this configuration. The first one here is the source image reference. So this is specifying which operating system that we want to run. And we're going to run an Ubuntu server. And this here will be the version of Ubuntu that we want to run here. At the end here, there's some custom data. This is Terraform specific. And this is something that will run once the virtual machine is spun up. And here we're going to install Docker on the machine, which we're going to use later on in the series when we deploy our app on this virtual machine. There's also something here called admin SSH key. And what I set up here is I'm just pointing to a public SSH key that I have on my local computer. And this will get added to the virtual machine. It will get attached to a new user with the username Azure user. And this is what we will be able to use then to SSH into the machine once it's spun up. Before moving on, I want to pause here a little bit on the size. Here that says standard B2TS V2. Now, I've had some issues, and this is where I spent hours, most of my time today actually, on trying to figure out which sizes, which disks from Azure can I use together with this Ubuntu image down here and together with the Azure account that I'm actually having. When I first started drafting this with Claude actually suggested something like BSM or BM or something like this, but it didn't work. I was not able to create the resource using Terraform. We were getting an error with Azure. And it turns out this has to do with quotas on Azure. So since I just created my account, I found my way to the quotas for my Azure subscription. And I think it can have something to do with me having a free tier. I actually upgraded it to a pay-as-you-go tier. But if we search here for BS, we could see a lot of these standard BS CPUs were having this warning triangle, and I was not able to, in any region, I tried the US, Europe, Asia, I was not able to use the standard BS CPUs. And I think this has to do with that these are high in demand, and perhaps my account is new and I was not able to actually select any of them. The CPUs that I did have available to me were larger and much more expensive CPUs that I didn't want to use. But I did find one thing, that the standard B and SV2, I'm not even sure what this is, but they're part of the standard B family of CPUs. From this quota screen here, I was actually able to adjust here. This said 0 of 0 earlier, and I was able to request an adjustment. And I typed in 10 here instead, and I sent it off. And this was automatic. So 5 minutes later or something, I had been granted a quota for the BSV2 family of CPUs. And I was then able to use that here for our virtual machine. And at this point, finally, I was able to spin this up. Now, the last thing we have in our Terraform file is this output command. This is just going to take the public IP that our virtual machine will get assigned and output that for us in the terminal so that we can use it. This will also be available to us in the Azure UI. Now, I think let's actually go ahead and run. We're going to cd into the infra folder. And then in order to spin up our infrastructure, we use the Terraform CLI with the apply command. So what this does is that it will find the main.tf file in the infra folder here. And at this point, since all of our services already, or all of our resources are already existing in Azure, I've run this before, it's going to compare it to its internal state, and it's going to see that we don't need to actually provision anything. All of this has already been done. But if you're setting this up for the first time and running Terraform apply, if you don't already have the resources created in Azure, Terraform will actually go ahead and first prompt you if you want to do it, and then go ahead and create those resources for you in Azure. And at the very end here, we can actually see the IP address, the public IP address for the virtual machine that we just created. Heading over to the Azure UI, and if we go to all resources, we do get a list of all of these different resources that we've created just using this one kind of Terraform file, configuration file. So we have the networks, we have the public IP address, and then we have the virtual machine and an associated disk with it. So let's go and see if we can SSH into this machine. To do that, we're going to need the IP address. And I think it was, Azure user at this IP address. And I've already done this before, so it's already recognized my SSH key. But immediately you can see that we are now logged into this machine that we've spun up and that we have available to us in Azure. And we can see that we also have, not wick, we want to say which. We can see that we have Docker installed now on this system as well, which is going to be good for us when we try and eventually deploy the app to this virtual machine. I was hoping we would get farther today actually to have the application deployed using Docker, but we're not going to get there today. I struggled too long with figuring out how to get the virtual machine deployed. So we'll pause here. We'll pause here for episode 1, and this will be a good space for us to continue moving forward. If you have any recommendations, ideas, or tips for me in pursuing this learning journey about DevOps and infrastructure in Azure, please let me know in the comments. I have some ideas on my own on where I want to go with this in the next couple of episodes, but I'm happy to take recommendations from any of you who are watching, hopefully, and might be interested in coming along on this journey. Thank you so much for watching. This has been episode 1, and hope to see you in episode 2. Bye.